Hello. So today's class is about climate change, and it's part of the same series that I'm trying to do this week of looking at various contemporary phenomena and processes from a social theory lens. It might seem kind of counterintuitive in terms of, well, climate change is, environmental problem, it's something to be dealt with by scientists, but it's very much connected to social theory and is the center of several debates within social theory. What is apparent in terms of what we've learned so far is one can quite easily argue that climate change is socially produced through a unending expansion of the capitalist economy, and it is also quite apparent that climate change's effects are unevenly distributed around the globe, right? And it has different impacts for different social groups located in spatially dispersed environments. In this book cover that I've put up here, the book titled Thinking Like a Climate by Hannah Knox, what I wanted to point your attention to was an insight from her ethnography of following urban governance initiatives in relation to climate change in Manchester, where she shows us how challenging it is for urban governance initiatives or governments or any other actors who are working on climate change to act in the face of a future that is unknown. How do you plan for something that is uncertain future or that is unknown, right? So there are questions of governance, there are questions of social inequality, questions of social construction, there are questions of how climate change becomes visible through models, through data sets, through graphs, through bureaucratic initiatives, through infrastructural planning and so on, that we will look at in today's class. So let's begin. We began this course in terms of social theory. We started looking at the classical political economists, and we spent quite some time looking at Marx. So today I want to go back to Marx in the beginning, and let's see what he had to say. And in some ways, his writings in Capital Volume 1 seems almost predictive, right? So Marx writes in chapter 15, all progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. All progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a progress towards ruining the more long-lasting sources of fertility. So he has already cautioned us about the unending quest for profit, about the ever-expansive and crisis-prone capitalism. I also want to bring your attention to Thomas Malthus, who in the 19th century alerted social theorists and practitioners to the disjuncture between heightened population growth and the limited resources that we have on this earth. I've put up the Malthusian curve over here, where Thomas Malthus on one end shows how population is growing exponentially, but then the production in terms of agriculture or food resources happens in a linear way. So at some point where the population overgrows or moves way past the food resources, he marks that point as a crisis point, and we refer to it as the Malthusian catastrophe. Now, obviously, Malthus was proved wrong in terms of how technology intervened, how newer inventions enabled or faster or more agricultural resources and food resources to become available. But then it did alert us, or it's alerting us of the problems of an unending growth still remain pertinent to our discussion even today. So Marx's critical insights have given way to the flourishing of a whole new subdiscipline that we refer to as political ecology. Drawing from Marx's work, the scholar John Bellamy Foster writes, Marx developed a theory of the metabolic rift, referring to the disruption of the material interchange between human beings and nature. So this separation of human beings as social and nature as backdrop or some resource to be exploited, this rift, this metabolic rift, as John Bellamy Foster is writing about, is what creates the fertile ground or the infertile ground for crises like climate change to take shape. Paul Robbins, in his critical introduction to political ecology, writes, political ecology combines the concerns of ecology and political economy to understand how environmental change is shaped by power and inequality. So, climate change has been attributed to the social life of modernity, to capitalism's unending growth, and to the crises that keep unfolding and our responses to them, and so is largely seen as something created through anthropocentric means. Another scholar who has written about this period of modernity where there is increased risk in terms of climate change, in terms of technology, in terms of diseases, in terms of disasters, is Ulrich Beck. Ulrich Beck looks at this period in modernity, what he calls new modernity, as a period of risk society. He writes, in advanced modernity, the social production of wealth is systematically accompanied by the social production of risks. So, in some ways he says, if the problem of the previous century was a problem of food or hunger, the problem of contemporary era is that of managing risk, right? So, that is because it's so uncertain and the future is so unclear that the risks are not immediately evident. Therefore, we are left scrambling in the last minute, always dealing with potential risks and disasters and so on. He also writes, many of the new risks escape perception entirely and are localized in the sphere of physical and chemical formulas. So, they become either scientific data or they are not quite evident because sometime in the future it will cause its effect. And this other scholars have also written about of this uncertain but also unknowable future that climate change brings in terms of our life on this earth. Another very interesting point that he makes is that these risks are unevenly driven, but they are unevenly distributed, yet some aspects of it are democratic. For example, he writes, smog is democratic, right? Whether you are rich or poor, if you are in the outdoors, you would end up breathing the polluted air. Now, one can say that somebody who can afford air purifiers or somebody who can be inside an air-conditioned car can to some extent control those risks. But largely, in terms of going out, you would still breathe that polluted air. But he also reminds us that the history of risk distribution shows that like wealth, risks adhere to the class pattern, but in inverse proportion. So, the lower your class in terms of its economic or social status, the more vulnerable you are to risk. So, you would probably inhabit the most risky area, you would probably inhabit the most polluted, the most toxic area in the city, or the third world, for example, has not contributed as much to climate change and yet is most at risk in terms of global warming and changing climate systems. On the other hand, we can also think about ocean fronts, where ocean fronts, everybody is culpable, but culpable to a different extent, right? Some will be affected more and some will be affected less. Vulnerabilities vary across social class, caste, gender, able-bodiedness, age, educational status, and so on. Now, I want to take some time in today's lecture to talk about my own work. This is collaborative work that I've done with the Sheher Collective as part of what is referred to as the Abohar Urban Project. I'm going to talk about this small city that we studied in the border of Punjab and look at how climate change appears in this small city. Now, you might say that climate change is a planetary problem, is a global problem. Why do you have to look at it in the context of a small city? Well, climate change, we argue, takes different shapes contingent upon the social, political, infrastructural and cultural situation in the context that it is in. In this project, we are trying to look at what climate change looks like from Abohar. Abohar is a small town at the border of Punjab, Rajasthan and Haryana. It lies in Punjab. It's also at the border of India and Pakistan. Being at the border has its own history, right? So, you are at the periphery, you are not in Chandigarh, which is the capital of Punjab as a state, and therefore away from decision making. It is not currently on any trade route, although it used to be in colonial times. It joined Multan with Delhi and had a huge role to play in trade at that time. Well, now it's no longer that. So it's quite peripheral. So it's peripheral and it's at the border. In order to look at Abohar from a climate change perspective, we looked at several scholars. And here I want to quote from Amitav Ghosh, who is a very well-known fictional writer, but also ethnographer, anthropologist, historian, and very, very widely read. I'm sure most of you would have read his works, and if not, I would encourage you to do so. He has his recent work on climate change. He titles it The Great Derangement. It is also this period that we inhabit right now is also often been referred to as the Great Acceleration, where the speed of change of life has been so fast that we are unable to make sense of it. And in The Great Derangement, Amitav Ghosh writes, when future generations look back upon the Great Derangement, our time period, they will certainly blame the leaders and the politicians of this time for their failure to address the climate crisis. But they may hold artists and writers equally culpable, for the imagining of possibilities is not, after all, the job of politicians and bureaucrats. So here, this particular text by Amitav Ghosh actually also implicates social theorists. Like, if we can't conceptualize, if we can't theorize how climate change engages with the social, engages with the political, then how do you act on it, right? We spoke about this before. You need a terminology, you need a theory, you need an understanding and an analytical lens in order to even act, right? And a lot of this cannot be done, as Dipesh Chakravarty will remind us, through the lenses that we already have, through the theories that we already have. And I'll talk about this as we move on further on this particular slide. So what are the current modes of thinking and practice that surround climate change, and why are they ineffective? They are ineffective because we know that we are not really acting in the proportion or to the extent that we need to in order to tackle climate change. And therefore, one can say that there is a certain lethargy in terms of acting for remedial measures for climate change, so there is inaction, right? And this inaction, Green reminds us, is a passive gaze that is the hallmark of our time. We often see things happening around us. We know that there are things which are perhaps not even just, socially just. We've taken inequality for granted. So there is a certain inaction that is characteristic of our times. But apart from that, climate change also appears as incomprehensible. It is too abstract or too remote a concept, right? Especially when we look at it as global climate change. Well, how do you even think about acting at a global level? Something that is happening is far away, maybe the polar caps are melting. How do you act towards something that appears far away or appears in models and charts that are too abstract? Yet, we also need to understand that global and local, urban and rural, national and international, in terms of climate change, these are all interconnected. And what we are arguing in our research on Abohar is that you need both. You need the larger understanding, as what Dipesh Chakravarty would call the planetary understanding, but you also need, we would argue, the local, situated, contextual understanding of this particular interconnectedness. I mean, climate systems, think about it, right? Ocean currents touch every continent in this world. The wind, if it starts from here, who knows what country it lands up in, there's the same air circulating. So, we are all quite intricately connected in this web of life and physical forces on this earth, and therefore, you can't just think locally. On the other hand, the problems of our social life, of our infrastructure life are very immediate and contextual, and therefore, the only way also that you can act is in that immediate context. So, one needs to constantly keep making that connection between the planetary and the local context. Going back to Amitav Ghosh, he says this particular problem, the problem of climate change and what to do about it, is peculiarly resistant to contemporary modes of thinking and imagining. So, he is in fact calling it a crisis of our imagination. I mean, we can read all the Marx and the Weber and the Durkheim and all the several scholars that we have read, but in order to make sense of climate change, we need to really unfold in terms of an imagination that is not quite linear, an imagination that is of things that we can't even see. He gives an example of whenever we write about potential disasters or potential risks or all of that, he says those come in the domain of science fiction, right? So we are not even imagining these very real possibilities in a way enough to act upon them. Going back to Dipesh Chakravarty, he gave 4 theses on the climate crisis and has written extensively on what he calls the planetary, right? And the planetary, he says, is different from the globe. Planetary is not just the political division of continents and countries on this earth. It is larger. It also includes the biophysical, the weather, the ecological, all of that which constitutes our planet. And that is the mode of thinking he is encouraging us to take. He writes, how is one to engage with anxieties precisely around climate futures that we cannot visualize? Something that I already made the point with the other scholars. And he says that the time for having a separate human history and a separate natural history is gone. You cannot see the 2 histories as separate because they are intertwined. And so therefore, this way of doing history, where we are only looking at empires and rulers and human life or political life is passé. We can't keep doing the same thing over and over again. We need to look at human history and natural history as intertwined histories. So that's the kind of history he's encouraging us to do. Coming back to Abohar. Abohar in 2020 was declared the 3rd dirtiest city of its size in the country. Now, coming from where it was an important node during colonial times of trade. It had one of the better laid sewage systems, water systems in the country. It is part of a wide array of canal networks. This came as a shock to the people of the city, right? We've reached from there to there. What happened in the middle? Like where it has streets which are on a grid, nicely planned mandi, important node, prosperous economy. Well, the economy kind of changed with the bollworm crisis that affected the cotton crop, which was the main crop that sustained the trade markets in Abohar. So you see the rural-urban connection here is also quite important in the context of the city. This I have put up a graph up here to show how the mean temperatures are rising in Abohar. You see increasing desertification, you see increasing temperatures and a reduction in the amount of rainfall. This graph does it to show the change in temperatures and rainfall during rice and wheat growing season. But the point is that the temperatures are rising and the rainfall is declining. And yet, you see immense amounts of urban flooding in Abohar, right? The intensity of the rain might have changed, but also, as we will show, there have been infrastructural changes and ecological changes, all very deeply intertwined, that have resulted in this kind of urban flooding in the city. One of the ecological things that is happening there is something that the locals call SAME. Now, SAME is basically waterlogged soils. The canal network that was laid during the colonial times had kacha embankments, right? So they had brick edges. And these brick edges have become pretty old now. Some bricks are dislodged, so water enters into the rest of the soil. And then this non-channelized water in the soil is also kind of moving across in the soil. So they say, the locals tell us, SAME आ गई है. SAME is that waterlogged soil. SAME आ गई है. कुछ साल पहले मलोट तक थी, अब अबोहर में है. So SAME has come. Till some time back, it was in Malot, and now it is in Abohar. So it's also a moving kind of a river. I mean, that's how one can imagine it. But it's not quite a river because it's basically waterlogged soil that has resulted from seepages from the canal network. So an infrastructural failure has caused it, but it is a significant ecological and also an infrastructural issue because the same then enters any built structure. So you see the dampness in the walls, for example, you see the corrosion of the pipes, the water pipes, the sewage pipes, and so on. So what we are arguing here is that you need to see infrastructure, ecology and economy as together in order to understand what climate change appears like in Abohar. So with increasing temperatures, increasing need of water, but then water becoming contaminated because of pesticides, because of same, nobody really drinks the piped water that comes in Abohar. So there is a whole economy that has developed in Abohar of water being sold in the private market through shops like this where RO water is being sold, or through tankers visiting neighborhoods. So as part of our project, we also tried to propose some small steps towards adapting to climate change in the Abohar, and I think in my last slide I will talk very briefly about that, especially considering our emphasis also on praxis in terms of looking at theory, but also in terms of what to do, right? The theory and practice together. In terms of infrastructure and ecology, so these corrosions that have happened of the pipe networks down below and the historical loss of memory, like nobody really knows when what pipe was laid, how it was laid, and then there has been the governmental efforts, but then some pipes were laid privately, and then pipes are corroding, and at many places drinking water supply and sewage pipes are intermingling because of the corrosion being caused by the same. So the government, the municipal corporation in Abohar has in fact started reverse kind of a mapping process where they are digging these deep holes to try and figure out which sewage line or water line is coming from where and going to which place. They've also started the desludging process of the soil. So this machine at the center of the road is doing that, is removing the excess moisture from the soil in order to make it back to what it was before the same came. Even non-rainful days, like even the days when it's not raining, you see water and sewage having leaked in the photograph below at several points in the street. We call this process archaeology of infrastructure. We'll quote from one of the plumbers whom we interviewed as part of this project, and he says, "Sometimes we find 3 or 4 water connections supplying water to one house, or we find 3 or more pipes of different sizes in the network. But out of these which are supplying water to the neighborhood remains unclear." So even as they are mapping it out, there is so much to figure out, to make sense of, and it's very, very difficult to do so. So can you imagine the kind of infrastructural, ecological, economic, governance things that are coming together in this understanding of how to deal with the urban flooding, part of it resulting from increasing temperatures, more sporadic but intense rainfall, but also legacy infrastructures that are now failing, and the history of the colonial canals which are now seeping water into the soil. And then contemporary developmental projects. So this is a map of the Abohar city, and basically it shows altitude, and what you see here is that the blue are the lower areas and the red are the more higher areas. If you see in the first map, already Abohar was slightly in a bowl shaped, right? So there were slightly higher terrains surrounding it, especially the ones in the canal are slightly higher, and the city slightly kind of appears in a bowl shape. But then a more recent highway that has come on the side, you see that in that mustard colored dot and dashed line on the right hand image below in the right hand corner. That's a highway that is being constructed. It's an elevated highway. Now that further exasperates the bowl shapedness of Abohar town, and therefore increases the possibility of flooding because water has no outlet now to go. So summarizing a bit of this, how does climate change appear in Abohar? One, like the same gives an example, the canals give an example, the pesticides give an example, the connection with the cotton crop and the urban mandi tells that story, is that the narrative of Abohar strongly challenges the rural-urban binary. You have to look at it together, you have to look at the whole, all these interconnected parts together to understand what is going on. Now infrastructures, when we build them, they fix, right, space. I mean, you can't build a road and then keep changing its location every time you wish. So it kind of is a fixed artifact or a fixed object, even as we studied in a previous class, we look at it as an assemblage, but it also has a certain fixed nature to it. On the other hand, with the same we see that there are ecological flows, and then when these two interact, we have several disjunctures also, right? Especially if the infrastructures have not acknowledged or not recognized the flows of ecology. That you see very clearly in the Abohar case. Colonial histories of the canals and post-colonial developments of hard paving materials, of elevated highways, have all contributed to urban flooding in Abohar. And then many of these decisions are made in the center. So many of these decisions might be made in Delhi or Chandigarh. So Abohar, where you do understand, where people might even understand what is the problem with a particular situation, that voice doesn't quite reach the center, and therefore decisions may not be made in the most appropriate way. So these are some of the challenges that this small town at the border faces. And then there is corporate greed, or there is the capitalist expansion, the constant extraction from land. Here we have put up a Google Earth image from 2001, 2009, 2016 and 2021 of the same chhappar. Chhappar are these small ponds which you will find them pretty much in every village in the country or the world, and in Punjab they are called chhappars. They are essential for watershed management of that region. So whenever there is excess water, it goes into the chhappar. Obviously, it's also used as a social, political, cultural space where villagers can gather, where events can happen, where groups of people could use it for everyday water related activities such as bathing or washing clothes and so on. So it has been an important part of the rural landscape in India, but also of the urban landscape. So Abohar also had several chhappars, but as you see, this particular chhappar here is slowly filled out, broken into privatized plots, and then sold off and built upon. And therefore, once again, just like the elevated highways didn't leave space for water to flow, these built structures have also not left spaces for excess water to be held in the city, right? That is why these areas are getting flooded. This project was a collaboration between IISER Mohali as a research institute and Studio Oriole, an architectural studio in Panchkula, and a group of Abohar urban fellows who were competitively selected from a nationwide call. So this whole group of architects, anthropologists, social theorists, historians, scientists, artists, landscape architects, government officials, engineers, all of us who call ourselves the Sheher Collective sat together and grappled with what to do in Abohar with the impending situation, the flooding crisis, the dirtiest city, all of that. There were several things that we spoke about, but largely it had to do with looking at how water and the built form, the structure, can work together. And so creating more spaces or more urban parks where excess rainwater could be managed or has a space to become a pond. I will not go into the details of this, but if you want, there is a link on the second or third slide when I started talking about this project by the Sheher Collective to our blog, and you can go back and look at it there. And this is the group of people that participated in this project. I really wanted to bring it to you to show you how theoretical perspectives both limit our imaginations, but then can also enable us to see things that are not immediately apparent. And that we need to work with theory, but we also need to work with theory with the notion of praxis. So with that, I'll end today's lecture. See you next class. Thank you.